Family is supposed to mean safety. The mother who carries you, who feeds you, who tucks you in at night is supposed to be the first wall between you and everything in the world that could hurt you. She is the one who steps in front of the danger. She is the one who covers the doorway. She is the one who refuses to leave the room. But for the women in these cases, the moment came when the danger was already inside the house, and there was no time to do anything but watch. They were in the bedroom next door. They were on the kitchen floor. They were on a hiking trail. They were on the phone in the hospital waiting room. The decisions they made in the next few seconds, and the silences they have carried in the years since, are what bind them together. Today we are covering 10 mothers who watched their families being murdered, and the moments that broke them open. Case 1. Gina Gonzalez. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning on May 30th, 2009, in a small desert community called Arivaca in southern Arizona, a phone call came in to the Pima County emergency line. The voice on the other end was a woman whispering. She was lying on the floor of her own kitchen. She had been shot 3 times. Her arm did not work properly. Her face was wet. She was telling the operator that the people who had done this were still inside her house. While she was speaking, those words turned out to be true. The line went silent for a moment. The operator could hear the woman moving across the floor. There was a sound of a screen door, a sound of footsteps coming back inside, and then the sound of more gunfire. The dispatcher kept the line open the entire time. The woman's name was Gina Marie Gonzalez. She was 31 years old. By the time the sun came up over the Sonoran Desert, her husband and her 9-year-old daughter would no longer be alive, and Gina would be the only living person in that house who could describe the 3 faces she had just seen at her front door. Gina Gonzalez had grown up in southern Arizona. She had married a young man named Raul Jr. Flores Jr. when she was still in her early 20s. He was a quiet, hard-working man who came home tired, but always made time for the people who lived in that small house with him. Their daughter, Brisenia Ileana Flores, had been born in 1999. She was the only child Gina and Raul had together, and she was the kind of 9-year-old who collected stuffed animals and lined them up on her bed every night before she went to sleep. Brisenia had her mother's smile and her father's quiet way of taking in a room. School photos from her last year of life show a child with long, dark hair and a serious mouth that softened the moment somebody said her name. She was in 4th grade. She had a stuffed chihuahua she carried everywhere. She wore turquoise pajama bottoms with a white t-shirt to bed almost every night. Gina also had an older daughter from a previous relationship. The 4 of them lived together in a small home off a quiet road in Arivaca, just north of the border with Mexico, where the closest neighbor was several minutes away by truck. Arivaca was the kind of place where people moved when they wanted to be left alone. The dirt road that led to the Flores home wound through mesquite trees and rocks. The home itself was a modest, single-story structure with a metal screen door at the front and an old porch light that buzzed at night. The Flores family had been living there for years. The kind of community where, on a normal night, the loudest sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. The trouble was, the desert outside Arivaca had drawn the attention of certain kinds of people. The home was less than 15 miles from the United States border with Mexico. By 2009, that border had become a destination for self-styled vigilante groups who claimed to be protecting the country from drug runners. One of those groups was led by a 41-year-old woman named Shauna Ford. She called her group Minutemen American Defense. She had a long history of run-ins with law enforcement, including theft, burglary, and prostitution as a younger woman. She had been married 4 times. She was, by every honest description, a woman with nothing in her life that resembled stability. By 2009, she had decided that the way to fund her group was to begin robbing the homes of people she suspected of being connected to drug traffickers. Ford had 2 men with her. One was a 43-year-old former Aryan Nations associate named Jason Eugene Bush, who went by the nickname Gunny. He had been imprisoned in the past for car theft and for possessing a firearm as a felon. He was, in every measurable way, a violent man with nothing left to lose. The third was a local Aravaca man named Albert Robert Gaxiola, who had personal grievances with Raul Flores. Gaxiola was the one who told Ford that the Flores family had drug money inside their home. There was no evidence whatsoever that the Flores family had any connection to drug trafficking. Raul Flores worked hard. He earned a regular paycheck. The lie had been planted, and Ford had decided to act on it. Just after midnight on May 30th, 2009, the three of them drove out to the Flores home. Ford had a plan that depended entirely on the family opening the door. They walked up to the front door and knocked. Inside, Raul Flores got out of bed and went to the door. Gina was nearby. Brezenia was asleep on the couch in the living room area, with her stuffed chihuahua next to her turquoise pajama bottoms still on. The home was quiet. Raul, half asleep, opened the door. The three intruders pushed their way inside. They told Raul they were officials searching for fugitives. The conversation lasted a matter of seconds. Bush raised his handgun and shot Raul in the head. Raul fell where he stood. Gina screamed. She rushed forward and Bush turned the gun on her. He shot her in the leg. He shot her again in the shoulder. She went down. He fired a third round into her body. He stood over her, and Gina, lying on the floor of her own home with her husband's body just feet away, made a single decision that would save her life. She closed her eyes. She did not move. She let her body go limp. She pretended she was no longer alive. Bush walked toward the small living area where Brezenia was sleeping. The little girl had heard the gunfire. She was sitting up on the couch, holding her stuffed chihuahua. She was 9 years old. Bush walked into the room and pointed his handgun at her. According to Gina's later testimony, Brezenia did what 9-year-olds do when they are confronted by something they cannot understand. She tried to talk her way out of it. She asked the man what he was doing. She asked him not to do anything. She told him she was just a little girl. She told him please. Her last words, according to her mother, were a plea for her own life. Bush shot her twice at point-blank range. She was gone instantly. She was still holding her stuffed chihuahua when she fell over on the couch. In the next room, Gina lay on the floor and made the most difficult decision a mother could ever make. She did not move. She did not cry out. She kept her eyes closed. She had already heard the gunshots in her daughter's room, and she knew. But if she made a sound, the same man would come back and finish what he had started. So she stayed where she was. She stayed there while Ford and Gaxiola walked through the rooms of her home, looking for the cartel money that did not exist. She stayed there as they grew frustrated, as they finally turned and walked out the front door. The screen door slammed behind them. Gina heard their footsteps fade across the dirt yard. Then she heard the sound of a vehicle starting up. Only then did she move. She crawled across the floor of her own kitchen. She left a trail of blood behind her. She found a phone. She dialed 911. The recording of that call has been played in courtrooms many times since. She is whispering. She is telling the operator that her husband and her daughter are no longer alive. She is telling the operator that she does not know how badly she has been wounded. And then the front door opens again. The three intruders had not driven far. They had circled back to make sure they had not left any witnesses. Ford and Bush walked in through the front door. Gina was still on the kitchen floor with the phone in her hand, still on the line with the dispatcher. The dispatcher could hear her speaking in short whispers, and then the dispatcher heard Gina go silent. Gina's husband had kept a handgun in the home. It was nearby. Gina, with one good arm, dragged herself toward it. She managed to get the weapon. She pulled herself up just enough to be able to see. When the two intruders came back through the doorway, she fired. Several rounds went off. Bush was hit in the leg. He cried out. Ford and Bush turned and ran. The intruders fled the house for the second and final time, leaving behind a wounded man's blood on the porch and the sound of a vehicle peeling out down the dirt road. Gina, with her arm broken in 2 places and 3 bullet wounds in her body, lay back down on the kitchen floor. The deputies arrived a short time later. They found Raul Flores in the entryway of the home. They found Brisenia in the living room, still on the couch, still holding her stuffed chihuahua. They found Gina on the kitchen floor with the phone next to her and a handgun a few feet away. She was conscious. She gave the deputies the description of 2 men and a white woman before she lost consciousness in the back of the ambulance. The next morning, Jason Bush limped into the trailer of one of his fellow Minutemen American Defense members, a man named Chuck Stonex, who later became a witness for the prosecution. Bush asked Stonex to treat his leg wound. Stonex did so, and when he later realized what had happened the night before in Arivaca, he went to the police. Within days, Ford, Bush, and Gaxiola were all in custody. Gina Gonzalez survived her wounds. She underwent multiple surgeries on her arm and her shoulder. She lost permanent function in parts of her body. She was discharged from the hospital weeks later and went home to a house where the bloodstains had been cleaned, but the silence was unbearable. She was 31 years old. She had buried her husband and her 9-year-old daughter on the same week. The home in Arivaca was no longer a home. It was a crime scene with the curtains still hanging. The trials began the following year. Gina sat in the courtroom and faced each of the 3 people who had walked into her home. She testified in clear and unwavering language about what she had seen and what she had heard. She described the moment her daughter had begged for her life. She described the moment she had pretended to be no longer alive. The juries listened. The prosecutor played the 911 call. They heard Gina whispering on the kitchen floor. They heard the silence in the middle of the call. They heard the gunfire. On February 14, 2011, Shauna Ford was found guilty on all 8 counts she had been charged with, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Raul and Brisenia, and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder for the attack on Gina. Ford was sentenced to die. She remains on death row in Arizona. Jason Bush was also sentenced to die for the killings and was given an additional 78 years for other crimes. He passed away from natural causes in custody in 2025. Albert Gaxiola was sentenced to life in a correctional facility without the possibility of parole. At Ford's sentencing, Gina stood in front of the woman who had ordered the attack on her family. She did not raise her voice. She told the courtroom that her daughter Brisenia had been a little girl who had loved her stuffed animals, who had been finishing 4th grade, who had been on the couch in her own home, in her own pajamas, when the strangers had come through the front door. She told the courtroom that her husband had answered his own front door because he had assumed the people on the other side were people who needed help. She told the courtroom that the only reason she was still alive was that she had decided to stay perfectly still while her family was being attacked around her, and that she had spent every day since then wondering whether that decision had been the right one. Then she sat down. Gina Gonzalez has not given many interviews in the years since. The home in Arivaca was eventually sold. The dirt road still winds through the mesquite trees. Gina raised her older daughter alone after that night, and she has spoken publicly only when it has been necessary, mostly to remind people that her daughter Brisenia was a real child who had a name and a stuffed chihuahua and turquoise pajama bottoms, and that she should be remembered as more than the youngest victim in a national news story. Brisenia Ileana Flores would have been 25 years old in 2025. Her mother is still here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the United States, but moves across the country to a quiet home in Richmond, Virginia. It is not a stranger this time. The man with the gun is the boyfriend a mother had welcomed into her own home. By the time the argument was over, 18-year-old son Zion would be gone. Her 14-year-old daughter Sadie would not survive the week, and the mother who had taken a bullet of her own would be the only person left to say their names. Case 2. Tiffany Terry. It was the afternoon of Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025, in a working-class neighbourhood of Richmond, Virginia called Highland Park. The kind of neighbourhood with small front yards, wide porches, and old trees that had been standing since before the houses were built. Tiffany Terry was in her own home. Her 18-year-old son Zion was in another room. Her 14-year-old daughter Sadie was somewhere nearby. Her boyfriend at the time, a 41-year-old man named Levy Nelson, was also inside the house. There had been an argument earlier that day. According to what Richmond police would later report, the argument had escalated. By the time the neighbours heard the first sound, the argument was no longer an argument. It was the sound of a firearm being discharged inside a family home in the middle of the afternoon. By the time the police arrived, 3 members of one family had been struck by bullets. By the end of the week, 2 of those family members would no longer be alive, and a mother would be sitting in a hospital bed, learning that the children she had raised by herself were both gone. Tiffany Terry was the kind of mother who, by her own description in a phone interview given to a local news station days after the attack, loved hard. She had a way of talking about her children that made it clear they were the centre of her universe. Zion was her eldest. He was 18 years old, a senior at John Marshall High School in Richmond. He was the kind of student who, in the words of his mother, made her proud just by being in a room. He had been voted prom king by his classmates earlier that month, which Tiffany had told reporters made her cry the first time she had heard about it. He was the protector of the family, the older brother, the one Sadie had looked up to since she had been a toddler. He had plans for after graduation. He had friends who would later post tributes to him online by the dozen. He had been getting ready, in those weeks before the attack, for the final quarter of his senior year. Sadie was 14 years old. She was an 8th grader at Henderson Middle School in Richmond. She was Tiffany's only daughter. She was the youngest in the family. She had been preparing to start high school in the fall. According to her mother, she had a way of making everyone around her feel like they were the most important person in the room. Tiffany would later describe her as a girl who loved hard, the same way her mother did, who hugged people without warning, who laughed at things her older brother said, even when his jokes were not funny. Sadie was the child who had spent that morning watching television with her mother before the day became what it became. The man who would change all of this was 41-year-old Levy Nelson. He had been in a relationship with Tiffany Terry. The exact length of the relationship was not made public in the days after the attack, but it was clear from later reporting that he had been a presence in the home long enough to be familiar with all 3 of them. According to Richmond police, Nelson had become involved in a verbal argument with the family inside the home that afternoon. The argument had gone on long enough for the people inside the house to be aware that something was wrong. The exact subject of the argument has not been made public. What is known is that Nelson had access to a firearm. What is known is that he used it on 3 members of the family. The first person hit by gunfire was Zion. He was 18 years old. He was inside the home he had grown up in. His mother had given birth to him 18 years and some months before the moment he was shot. He was hit multiple times. According to the medical reports later released to the public, the wounds Zion received that afternoon were not survivable. He passed away at the scene before paramedics could reach him. The Richmond police statement released later that evening confirmed that one person had not made it through the day. The neighbours stood outside on their lawns and watched the ambulances and the patrol cars and the yellow tape go up around the house. The second person struck by gunfire was Sadie. She was 14 years old. She was nearby when her older brother was shot. She was hit at close range. She was conscious when paramedics arrived. She was airlifted to the hospital. Her injuries were described in early reporting as serious. The doctors at the hospital fought for her over the next several days. Tiffany was told at one point that her daughter might survive. She was told at another point that the prognosis was changing. She sat at the hospital bedside through the weekend. On Friday evening, 4 days after the attack, Sadie passed away in the hospital. Tiffany had now lost both of her children. One had not made it past Tuesday afternoon. The other had not made it past Friday night. The third person struck by gunfire was Tiffany herself. She had been hit during the same exchange. She had survived her wound. She was treated at the hospital. According to the official Richmond police statement, she was the surviving witness who could describe what had happened inside her own home. She was the only person remaining who could put a name and a face to the man who had pulled the trigger. Levy Nelson did not stay at the scene. He fled. The Henrico police, working alongside the Richmond Police Department, launched a search for him almost immediately. The neighbours had given descriptions. The home had physical evidence. Tiffany, even in a hospital bed, was able to give law enforcement the name and the description of the man who had attacked her family. Within hours, Henrico police arrested Nelson. He was charged with malicious wounding and use of a firearm during the commission of a felony. After Sadie's passing on Friday, additional charges were expected. Officials said at the time that more charges, including more serious ones, were forthcoming. In the days following her release from the hospital, Tiffany Terry did something that very few mothers in her position have the strength to do. She picked up the phone. She gave an interview to local news stations. She did this not to talk about Levy Nelson. She did this because, in her own words, she did not want her children to be remembered only as a tragedy. She wanted the world to know who they had been before they had been on the news. She told reporters that Zion had been her oldest son. She told them he had been her protector. She told them he had been crowned prom king the same week he had lost his life, and that the photograph of him in the prom king crown was now the photograph that would stand in every memory she had of him. She told them she thanked God she had been allowed to be his mother. She told them about Sadie. She told them Sadie had been her only daughter. She told them all the people Sadie had touched in her short 14 years on Earth would always have a piece of her with them. A community fundraiser was set up almost immediately. By early the following week, donations to support the Terry family had passed nearly $50,000. Local pastors visited the home. Classmates from John Marshall High School gathered outside the family's house with candles. Sadie's classmates from Henderson Middle School made cards and posters. Family members spoke to reporters about the kind of children Zion and Sadie had been. The neighbourhood of Highland Park had not seen anything quite like the funeral that took place for those two children, in the same week, in the same church, in front of a mother who had been shot 4 days before she had to choose what her daughter was going to wear in her casket. The legal case against Levy Nelson moved forward. The Henrico County Commonwealth's Attorney's Office stated publicly that further charges, including charges that reflected the deaths of both children, would be added. The proceedings would go on for months. Tiffany, in the meantime, was learning how to live in a house with 2 empty bedrooms. Tiffany has spoken about the silence in the home. She has spoken about the way she still finds herself walking to one of the doorways out of habit, expecting to see one of her children standing inside. She has spoken about the way certain songs that Sadie used to play on her phone still come on the radio sometimes. She has spoken about the prom king crown. Tiffany has also spoken about the impossibility of choosing how to grieve when there are 2 children to grieve at the same time. She told one reporter that a mother is not supposed to bury her children at all. She told another that the worst part was not the funeral. The worst part, she said, was the second day after the funeral, the day after the casseroles stop coming, the day after the relatives go home. The day a mother walks into her own kitchen and realises that there is no one left in the house who needs her to make breakfast. She said it had changed her. She said it would change her for the rest of her life. She also said, and this part was the part that most of the local news anchors quoted in their broadcasts, that she still loved hard, and that her children had loved hard, and that the people they had touched were going to carry pieces of them forever. The case against Levy Nelson is still unfolding through the courts at the time of this writing. A community in Richmond is still grieving. A mother is still living in a home with 2 empty bedrooms. The first quarter of 2025 brought one of the most painful family tragedies the city of Richmond had seen in years, and at the centre of it stood Tiffany Terry. She was the mother who had been shot in the same room as her son. She was the mother who had sat at the hospital bedside of her daughter for 4 days. She was the mother who had buried both of her children in the same week. She was the only living member of that small family from Highland Park who could still walk into a room and say the names of Zion Terry and Sadie Terry out loud. Tiffany Terry's story has become part of a larger national conversation about violence inside American homes. The Terrys had been a family like any other family. They had been 3 people in a small home in Richmond. They had been a mother, a son, and a daughter. They had been planning a graduation. They had been planning a high school summer. What is remembered now in Highland Park is not the afternoon of April 22nd, 2025. What is remembered is what existed before it. A senior class prom king, a middle school 8th grader who could make the room laugh, a mother who loved hard. The bedroom doors that used to stand open in a small house in Richmond now stand closed most of the time, and the photographs on the living room walls have been rearranged so that the prom king crown is the first thing a person sees when they walk in the front door. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story north to a quiet, upscale suburb of Philadelphia, where a mother named Bernardet Gordio was asleep in her own home in the early hours of a December morning. Her 25-year-old son, Andrew, was the one who heard the basement door give way first. By the time the ambulances arrived, he had fought back hard enough to save her life and had lost his own in the process. Case 3. Bernardet Gordio. It was the very early hours of Sunday, December 8, 2024, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Lower Merion Township, an upscale suburb just outside the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The clocks on the bedside tables in the Gordio home read just after 2:20 in the morning. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people moved when they had spent decades working and finally wanted a quiet street to come home to. Wide front lawns, mature trees, holiday lights still up on most of the houses for the season. The kind of place where the loudest sound at that hour was usually a neighbor's dog letting out a single bark before going back to sleep. Inside the Gordio home, 61-year-old Bernardet Gordio was asleep. Her 25-year-old son, Andrew, was also asleep nearby. In the basement of the home, a side door that opened from below had been quietly forced open from the outside. By the time the sun came up over Lower Merion Township that morning, Bernardet would be in critical condition at a Pennsylvania hospital with multiple gunshot wounds, and her son Andrew would no longer be alive. He had used the last minutes of his life trying to protect her. Bernardet Gordio was, by every account from family members and neighbors who later spoke to local Philadelphia news stations, a woman who had built a calm life in a calm neighborhood. She was a long-time resident of Lower Merion Township. She had raised her son in the same area. The home where the attack took place was the home she had lived in for many years. She had a green Jeep Cherokee parked in her driveway, a 2004 model that had been with her for decades. The kind of vehicle that has more than just transportation value attached to it. She had jewellery in her bedroom that had belonged to family members who had passed before her, including a jewellery box that held items going back generations. She was the kind of homeowner who knew her neighbours by name and who had watched the children on the block grow up over the years. She and Andrew lived together in the home, a quiet mother and son arrangement that worked because they had built it together. Andrew Gordio was 25 years old at the time of the attack. He had grown up in that same Lower Merion home. Family members would later describe him as a young man who was protective of his mother in a way that most 25-year-old men no longer are about their mothers. He had stayed close to home. He had remained in his mother's life on a daily basis. He was the kind of son who, when his mother needed something at the grocery store, was the one who went and got it. He was the kind of young man who, when something woke him in the middle of the night in his own home, did not hide. He went to investigate. The choice he made in the small hours of December 8, 2024, was the kind of choice that, in hindsight, seems almost inevitable for a son like Andrew. It was also the choice that would cost him his life. The man who broke into the Gordio home that night was later identified by the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office as a 33-year-old named Kelvin Roberts. He was driving a white Hyundai Azera that had been linked to an address on Sansom Street in Philadelphia. He had come from outside the neighborhood. He had selected the Gordio home for reasons that, in the days and weeks that followed, were not made fully clear to the public. The district attorney would later state that police were not certain whether the crime was targeted or random. What was clear was that Roberts had entered the home through the basement, that he was armed, and that he had not come to leave the property without taking something with him. Bernadette's jewelry box was a target. Bernadette's Jeep Cherokee was a target. The two people sleeping inside the home were obstacles. The exact sequence of what happened inside the Gordio home in those early morning minutes has been reconstructed from the eventual statements of the surviving witness, from the physical evidence collected by Lower Merion Township Police, and from the public statements made by the Montgomery County District Attorney Kevin Steele at the news conference that followed. Bernadette was awakened by sounds inside the home. Andrew was awakened too. Both of them realized in those first foggy seconds of being pulled from sleep that someone who did not belong was in the house with them. Andrew moved first. According to District Attorney Steele's later statement to reporters, Andrew fought back. He tried to help his mother. He stood between his mother and the man with the gun. He did the thing that a 25-year-old son does without thinking when his mother is in danger. He did not run. He did not hide. He went toward the threat. The intruder fired. Andrew was struck multiple times. The injuries he received were severe. According to officials, he did not survive those wounds. He passed away in the home he had grown up in the home he had been trying to defend, just a few feet away from the woman whose life he had been trying to save. He was 25 years old. Bernadette was also struck by gunfire. She was hit multiple times. According to the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office, the wounds she received were critical. Roberts, having shot both Andrew and Bernadette, took what he had come for. He took the jewelry box that contained her family heirlooms. He went out to the driveway, climbed into Bernadette's green 2004 Jeep Cherokee, and drove away from the home in the stolen vehicle. He left behind the wreckage of a small family in the early morning silence of an upscale Pennsylvania neighborhood. What he did not understand as he drove away was that Bernardet Gordio was not yet finished. In the worst pain of her life, with multiple bullet wounds in her body, in a home that was now silent because her son was no longer breathing, Bernadette pulled herself toward a phone. She found a way to dial 911. The dispatcher who took her call later became part of the public record of the case. Bernadette gave the dispatcher her address. Bernadette told the dispatcher what had happened. Bernadette gave the dispatcher whatever description she could of the man who had been in her home. She did this while bleeding from multiple wounds. She did this knowing that her son, somewhere nearby, was no longer alive. She did this because, in that moment, the only thing that could be done was to stay on the phone long enough for help to arrive. The Lower Merion Township Police Department arrived at the home minutes later. They found Andrew where he had fallen. They found Bernadette where she had managed to make her phone call. She was rushed to the hospital. Her condition was listed as critical when she arrived. The doctors began the long process of trying to keep her alive. Lower Merion Township had not seen a home invasion of this severity in years. The neighbours woke up that morning to the sound of police vehicles and ambulances and the slow realisation that something had happened on their block that none of them had thought possible. The investigation moved at speed. Within hours, Lower Merion Township Police had a piece of evidence that would crack the case wide open. A police vehicle in the area had captured dashcam footage of a white Hyundai Azera leaving the scene of the home invasion at the relevant time. The footage showed the driver. The Hyundai Azera was traced back to an address on Sansom Street in Philadelphia. Police went to the Sansom Street address. They showed the photograph from the dashcam to a person at the residence. That person identified the driver as Kelvin Roberts. Inside the Sansom Street residence, police recovered Bernadette Gordio's stolen jewelry box. The box that had been in her bedroom in Lower Merion Township only hours before was now on a property in Philadelphia, surrounded by physical evidence that linked Roberts to the attack. The green Jeep Cherokee, the vehicle that had been parked in Bernadette's driveway for years, was recovered the same Sunday in West Philadelphia. It had been abandoned. The keys had been left in the ignition. The district attorney's office made it clear that the recovery of the Jeep was part of a chain of evidence that left almost no doubt as to who had been driving it. Montgomery County District Attorney Kevin Steele held a press conference about the case. Photographs of Kelvin Roberts went up on every local news station. A $5,000 reward was announced for information leading to his arrest. A second, unidentified individual was also believed to have been involved in the home invasion, though Roberts was the one police had identified as the gunman. The district attorney told reporters that they were dealing with a dangerous person. He told reporters that the family had been through something that no family should ever have to go through. He told reporters that Andrew Gordio had fought back, that he had tried to help his mother, that he had given his life in the attempt. Bernardet Gordio remained in critical condition at the hospital for days. The district attorney's office said in a follow-up statement that she appeared to be moving in the right direction and that they were hopeful she would survive. The doctors fought for her. The hospital staff fought for her. She was, in the words of family members who spoke to local news, a fighter. She had already proved as much by getting herself to the phone in the first place. Eventually, after a long stretch of medical work, she was stable enough to be considered out of immediate danger. She survived the wounds. She survived the surgery. She survived the long hospital stay that followed. By the time she was released, she had to walk out of the hospital and back into a home where her son was no longer alive. The full charges against Kelvin Roberts have continued to make their way through the Montgomery County court system. The investigation into the second individual believed to have been involved has continued. The community of Lower Merion Township has held its breath through every stage of the proceedings. Bernadette has been protected by family members and by victim advocacy services from the worst of the public exposure that comes with a case of this size. She has not given many interviews. The few public statements that have come from her family describe a mother who is still grieving, who is still healing physically, who is still trying to understand how a Sunday morning in December changed every other Sunday morning that would ever come after it. Andrew Gordio's funeral was attended by family, by friends he had known since elementary school, and by neighbours from the block where he had grown up. The kind of small Pennsylvania neighbourhood funeral where everybody who attends has their own private story about the person inside the casket. He was 25 years old. He had spent the last few seconds of his life standing between his mother and a man with a gun. The district attorney has continued to describe his actions in those minutes as the actions of a young man whose first instinct was to protect the person who had given him life. Bernardet Gordio's experience that night left a permanent mark on the community of Lower Merion Township. Neighbourhood watch programs saw a renewed wave of interest. Residents of the block began installing new security cameras, new lighting, new motion sensors. The conversations on the front lawns in the weeks that followed were different from the conversations that had taken place there before. The understanding that this kind of thing could happen, even in this kind of neighbourhood, even at this hour, even to people whose only connection to anything was a green Jeep Cherokee in the driveway and a jewellery box on the dresser, was an understanding that the residents were now forced to carry with them. What stays in the public record about Bernardet Gordio is the picture of a 61-year-old mother lying on the floor of her own home, bleeding from multiple wounds, with her son no longer alive nearby, somehow finding the strength to drag herself to a phone and stay on the line long enough to give a dispatcher the information that would eventually identify the man responsible. The picture of a son who had heard a sound in the basement and had decided to go check on it because his mother was sleeping in the next room. The picture of a green Jeep Cherokee with the keys left in the ignition on a side street in West Philadelphia. The picture of a small jewellery box returned to its owner, empty of the things that had given it meaning, but home again. Bernadette is still alive. Andrew is not. The two of them, in the early hours of December 8, 2024, did the only thing they could think to do. They tried to protect each other. One of them succeeded. The other did not come back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the same year, but moves westward into Illinois, where a young mother named Alexia Templar was awakened in the early hours of a February morning by the sound of 3 armed men coming through her front door. She had 2 daughters in the house with her. Both of them were under the age of 2. The 30 bullet holes that police would later count in the walls of her home and the 4 shots that came from her own gun are the only reason any of them are still alive. Case 4. Alexia Templar. It was the early hours of Monday, February 10th, 2025, in a neighborhood near Stone Street and Whitmer Street in Decatur, Illinois. The kind of Decatur block where the houses sit close enough together that a neighbor's porch light shines onto your front yard. Alexia Templar was 23 years old. She was a mother of 2. Her partner was at work that night, working an overnight shift, which meant that the only people inside the house were Alexia and her 2 small daughters. The older daughter was barely 2 years old. The younger one was an infant. Both of them were asleep when the front door of the house came open. 3 armed men in the dark of an Illinois winter morning had just walked into the home of a young mother and her babies. By the time the gunfire stopped, there would be nearly 30 bullet holes in the walls of her house. 2 of them would be inside her own body, and one of the 3 intruders would be lying somewhere across town with a bullet wound from her own gun. All 3 of her children, including her 2 small daughters and herself, would still be alive. The reason any of them were still alive came down to the 4 shots that had come from Alexia's hand. Decatur is the kind of mid-sized Illinois city that does not appear in national news as often as Chicago does, but that has its own long, complicated history with violent crime. It is a working-class place. Most of the homes on the block where the Templar family lived were the kind of small, single-story houses that families had been raising children in for generations. Alexia had been one of those young mothers. She was not yet 25 years old. She had 2 daughters under the age of 2. She had a partner who worked nights. She had built a small, tight life for her children. The night of February 9th going into February 10th, she had put her daughters to bed in the same way she had put them to bed every other night. She had gone to bed herself. She had no reason to expect anything different from any other Sunday night going into a Monday morning. Around the early hours, Alexia woke up to a sound she could not identify. The sound was the sound of her front door being forced open. According to her own later interview with 12 News WCIA, her first thought was that she needed to get to her children. She moved fast. She got into the room where the older girl was sleeping. She picked her up. She moved toward the room where the infant was sleeping. She picked her up too. By the time she had both of her children in her arms, the 3 intruders were already inside the house with weapons drawn. Alexia would later describe what happened next in clear, unflinching detail. She told the WCIA reporter that in that moment she could not panic. She had 2 daughters who needed her. She had 2 daughters who needed her to protect them. She made a decision in the next several seconds that, by every account in the local press coverage that followed, kept all 3 of them alive. She moved both of her daughters into a closet. She closed the closet door. She told them, in whatever broken way a young mother can tell 2 children under the age of 2 anything, to stay there. She closed the door behind them. She herself was now standing alone in a hallway of her own home, between the closet door where her babies were hidden and 3 armed men who had just come through her front door. Alexia's partner kept a firearm in the home. She knew where it was. She got to it. She did not have time to think about what was about to happen next. She positioned herself so that the closet door, the door behind which her 2 daughters were hiding, was behind her. She turned to face the 3 intruders. The exchange of gunfire that followed, according to Decatur police, lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, nearly 30 rounds were discharged inside the small home. Alexia returned fire 4 times. She was hit twice. 1 bullet went through and through. Another bullet did the same. According to the medical reports that came out of the case in the days afterward, she was struck while one of her daughters was in her arms. Her older daughter, the toddler, was within feet of her at one moment. Bullets passed through walls. Bullets passed through door frames. The closet door where her infant and her toddler were hiding was struck by gunfire. Both of her children remained physically unharmed. The bullets that went into Alexia's body did not hit any major blood vessels. The bullets that came out the other side did not strike her children. She would later describe this with a phrase she repeated more than once. She said the bullets went through and through. She said luckily there were no major blood vessels hit, no bone fragments found. While she was bleeding, while she was reloading, while she was watching the three intruders begin to retreat toward the front door, her older daughter ran out of the closet and toward her. The 2-year-old, hearing her mother's voice and confused by what was happening around her, came running into the hallway. According to Alexia's later interview, she described that moment as the moment her instincts took over, even harder than they had taken over before. She told the news reporter that she was screaming at her own children, pleading with the men in the room, begging them not to take the lives of her babies. She remembers shouting, "Please don't kill my kids." She remembers shouting, "I have kids." She remembers shouting, "Please don't kill me, please." The words came out of her in the order they came out, not because she was thinking about them, but because they were the only words she had left. She had also done something during the firefight that would, in the hours that followed, change everything for the Decatur Police Department. One of her 4 shots had hit one of the intruders. He had been wounded. He had been struck in the lower back. He had managed to get out of the house, but the wound was real. The 3 intruders fled the home before paramedics arrived. Alexia, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds, picked up her children. She got them out of the closet. She got herself to a phone. She called for help. Her partner came home from work. He was the one who got her to St. Mary's Hospital where her injuries were treated. They were described in the Decatur news coverage as non-life-threatening. Both bullets had gone through her without striking anything that would have ended her life. Both of her children were physically unharmed. The medical professionals at St. Mary's did everything they needed to do to stabilise her. She would survive her wounds. Her partner would be allowed to take her home. Her children would be allowed to come home with her. The home itself, however, would never quite be the same home it had been before. While Alexia was being treated at the hospital, the Decatur Police Department was already moving. They had been notified of a shootout at the home. They had also been notified that same day of a young man who had walked into a Decatur emergency facility with a bullet wound in his lower back. The 2 reports lined up. Officers connected the dots. The man with the bullet wound was a 24-year-old named Deontay Stone. Stone was taken into custody. Through Stone, police identified the second of the 3 intruders, a 25-year-old named Colton Clark. Through Stone and Clark, police identified the third, an unnamed 16-year-old, who was sent to the Peoria County Juvenile Detention Center. All 3 of them were charged with attempted murder. They were charged with home invasion. They were charged with aggravated battery with a firearm. The Macon County Jail held Stone and Clark on charges that, in the words of one law enforcement source quoted in the local press, reflected the seriousness of what had nearly happened to a young mother and her 2 daughters in their own home. Alexia Templar, less than a week after being released from the hospital, agreed to sit down for a television interview with the local news station WCIA. The interview is one of the most striking pieces of survivor testimony in the recent history of Illinois local journalism. She sat in front of the camera. She had bandages still visible. She had a quiet, calm voice. She did not raise her tone. She did not cry. She talked through the events of the morning of February 10th, 2025, with the kind of steadiness that most people would not have been able to find within themselves in the same circumstances. She told the reporter, in her own words, that in the moment she could not panic. She had 2 daughters who needed her in that moment, and she needed to protect them. She told the reporter about pleading for the lives of her children. She told the reporter that she still felt fear even after the suspects had been arrested. She also told the reporter something that has been quoted in a number of local outlets since. She said, "The only thing that was important to me was keeping them safe." That sentence, said in the calm voice of a young mother sitting in front of a small camera in Decatur, Illinois, has become the line that the case is remembered by. Both of Alexia's daughters survived without physical injury. The toddler was old enough to remember some of what had happened in the hallway that morning. The infant was not. Alexia herself recovered from her wounds within weeks. Her partner returned to work. The home itself bore the marks of the gunfire for some time afterward. Alexia later said in follow-up interviews that the bullet holes in the walls of the home remained part of her daily routine in the weeks that followed. That walking past them on the way to the bathroom in the morning was the kind of detail that she had never expected to have in her life as a young mother. The three suspects continued through the Macon County court system in the weeks and months following their arrests. Stone, Clark, and the unnamed 16-year-old all faced charges that carried significant correctional facility time if convicted. The investigation, as it progressed, did not make clear in any public statement that has been released so far whether the home invasion was targeted or whether the three intruders had been looking for a different home in the neighborhood. The police were direct in saying that the violence inside the home was real, and that the only reason the children inside that closet were still alive was that their mother had positioned herself between them and the gunfire and had refused to move. The story of Alexia Templar joined a long, painful list of stories about young mothers in working-class American neighborhoods who, through nothing but their own decisions in the worst minutes of their lives, kept their children alive. She is 23 years old. She has two daughters who are still under the age of 3. She has gone back to her ordinary daily life. She does her grocery shopping. She picks up the older one's toys. She makes the bottles for the younger one. She has spoken publicly about the fact that random violence happens to families that nobody ever expects it to happen to, and that she now knows it can happen to anyone. What has been said about her in the Decatur press coverage, repeatedly, is that her 4 shots were the 4 shots that mattered. The 30 bullets that the 3 intruders fired at her had not stopped her. The 2 bullets that had passed through her own body had not stopped her. The closet door full of her infant and her toddler had not been opened by any of those 3 men. The reason it had not been opened was that a 23-year-old young mother had stood in front of it with a handgun and made a decision in the worst minute of her life that her children would not be the ones who came out of that room without their mother. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story westward to a quiet apartment in Mesa, Arizona, where a mother named Jackie Horn was woken at 4 a.m. by the sound of her 16-year-old daughter Layla screaming her name from the next room. The man inside the apartment had a knife. He was a complete stranger. By the time the sun came up over the Sonoran Desert, Jackie would be in the hospital with a brain bleed, a paralyzed face, and the kind of stab wounds that would require staples to close. Case 5. Jackie Horn. It was just after 4 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, September 17, 2025, in an apartment complex near Broadway Road and Dobson Road in Mesa, Arizona. The kind of complex where the buildings sit 2 stories tall, where the walkways between the units are open to the air, where a person walking up to a particular front door would be visible from the parking lot below in the daylight, but would disappear into shadow at 4 in the morning. The desert outside was still cool from the overnight hours. The sun would not be up for another 2 hours. Inside one of the second-floor apartments, a mother named Jackie Horn was asleep in her bed. Her 16-year-old daughter Layla was in another bedroom. Her younger daughter Jax was also in the apartment. The 3 of them were the only people inside the home that night. The door was locked. The windows were closed. By the time the sun came up over the Sonoran Desert, Jackie would be in an emergency room with a small bleed in her brain, a paralyzed nerve in her face, blurry vision in her left eye, and multiple stab wounds across her body. Both of her daughters would also be in the hospital with stab wounds. The man with the knife was a stranger she had never met in her life. Jackie Horn, by every account she gave in her later interview with the Phoenix television station 12 News, had built a calm life inside that small Mesa apartment. She was a working mother. Her 2 daughters were the center of her life. Layla, the older one, was 16 years old. She was the kind of teenager who, like most teenagers, slept hard. The younger daughter, Jax, was younger still. The 3 of them had a routine. The apartment was small, but it was theirs. The night before the attack, the three of them had gone to bed at the times they normally went to bed, in the rooms they normally slept in. There was no reason to expect anything to happen. The first sound Jackie heard was a loud noise that pulled her out of sleep. She would later tell the 12 News reporter that she could not immediately identify what the sound had been. Then she heard another sound, and this one she could identify. She heard her daughter Layla calling out for her. Layla's voice was getting more frantic. Layla was saying, "Mom, Mom, Mom," in the tone of voice that a 16-year-old uses when something is happening that she does not understand and cannot control. Jackie was already moving by the time the third call of her name reached her. She was out of her bed and heading toward the room where her daughter was. What Jackie found when she got to her daughter's bedroom was a stranger. A grown man, who Jackie had never seen before in her life, was inside her 16-year-old daughter's bedroom, and he had a knife. He had broken into the apartment. He had not made it through the front door without making noise, but he had made it through. He was already attacking Layla when Jackie reached the room. The man's name, as Mesa police would later release, was Dawn. He had no connection to the Horn family. He had selected their apartment essentially at random, as part of what investigators would later describe as a pattern of attempted break-ins in the Mesa area that same morning. Jackie did the thing that mothers do without thinking. She got between the stranger and her daughter. The attack that followed lasted, by every account, only minutes. But in those minutes, all three of them, Jackie, Layla, and the younger daughter Jax, who came out of her own bedroom into the hallway, were stabbed. The knife was a real, full-sized blade. The wounds were real. Jackie took the worst of it. According to the medical reports, Jackie suffered a small brain bleed caused by blunt impact during the attack. She suffered a nerve injury to her face that left part of her face temporarily paralyzed. She suffered blurry vision in her left eye, the result of swelling from the trauma. She had multiple stab wounds across her body that required stitches and staples to close. Both of her daughters were also stabbed. Layla, the 16-year-old, had been the first one attacked, the one whose voice had pulled Jackie out of sleep. Jax, the younger one, had also been wounded. Both of them required stitches and staples. Both of them survived. The detail that has stayed with anyone who has watched Jackie's interview with 12 News is the calm in her voice when she describes the moment her 16-year-old started calling out for her. She describes hearing the panic in her daughter's voice. She describes the way her own body started moving before her mind had caught up. Jackie was a mother in her own home. There was nothing else her body could have done. The man with the knife eventually fled the apartment. According to the Mesa police statement, Dawn had broken into the Horn apartment with what court documents would later describe as intent to kill. He had told a prosecutor after his arrest that he had been struggling with mental health issues and using illegal substances. The combination of those two factors, according to the prosecution, did not reduce his accountability. He was held on a $2 million cash bond. He had also tried, that same morning, to break into a different apartment in the same area. A man at that other home had confronted Dawn at his door. Dawn had moved on. The Horn apartment had been the next attempted entry. Investigators believed there was no specific reason Dawn had chosen that particular apartment. He had been looking for any door he could get through. Jackie called for help. Despite her own injuries, despite the bleeding, despite the brain trauma she did not yet know she had sustained, she got herself to a phone. She called 911. The paramedics who arrived found 3 wounded family members in a small Mesa apartment, all of them with stab wounds, all of them conscious, all of them able to give the responding officers a description of the man with the knife. Jackie's testimony, even in the worst moments of her own injuries, was clear enough that Mesa police were able to begin the search for Dawn within minutes. The search did not take long. Dawn was located later that same morning and taken into custody. He was charged with multiple counts of attempted murder, home invasion, and aggravated assault. Court documents released during the prosecutor's statement made clear that Dawn had told investigators he had broken in with the specific intent to take a life inside the apartment. The prosecutor, addressing the judge during the bond hearing, said that the charges reflected the deliberate nature of the attack. While Dawn was being held in custody, Jackie was being treated at a Mesa hospital. The brain bleed was small enough that it should clear on its own with rest. The nerve injury to her face was expected to recover gradually. The blurry vision in her left eye was expected to improve once the swelling went down. The stab wounds, while serious, had not struck anything that would end her life. Jackie had also been the reason her daughters had survived. By stepping between the stranger and her teenage daughter, by making herself the target, she had taken the worst of the wounds onto her own body. The 12 News interview that Jackie agreed to do after she was released from the hospital became one of the most quietly powerful pieces of survivor testimony out of Phoenix in 2025. Jackie sat in front of the camera with the visible signs of the attack still on her face. The drooping nerve, the faint discoloration, the careful, deliberate way she spoke as the words came out of a face that was still partially paralyzed. She said, "We survived." She said, "We did that as a family." She said, "That was the only thing that was important to me, was keeping them safe." Jackie also spoke about the way the world had stopped feeling the way it used to feel. She told the 12 News reporter that even after Dawn had been arrested, the fear had not left her. She said, "I'm very glad that they found him, but it doesn't take away the fear like I think it should." The fear, in her words, had taken up residence inside her in a way that she could not undo by knowing the man's name and his location. She also spoke about the way the apartment complex itself had handled the aftermath. According to an email she shared with the news station, the management had initially told other residents that the stabbing was a personal attack. This had not been true. Investigators had confirmed that Dawn was a stranger to Jackie and her family, that he had been attempting to break into other units, and that the choice of the Horn apartment had been more or less random. Jackie had wanted other residents in the building to know what had actually happened. In the weeks after the interview aired, the Horn family began the process of finding a new home. Jackie told the news station that returning to the apartment was not something she could do. The walls held the memories. The hallway between the bedrooms was the same hallway where the attack had taken place. The closet door Jackie had passed on her way to her daughter's bedroom was the same door. The family agreed that whatever the future looked like for them, it would not look like that apartment. Layla and Jax both went back to school. Both of them are recovering from the physical wounds. The unseen wounds, as Jackie put it in the interview, are the harder ones. Both of the daughters, Jackie said, have been carrying things they cannot put into words. The 16-year-old in particular has been processing the night in the way that 16-year-olds do when something happens to them that nobody around them at school has any way of understanding. Jackie has been doing what she can to support both of them. She has been the kind of mother who is making sure her children know that what happened to them does not define them. The criminal case against Dawn has continued through the Maricopa County court system. The prosecution has indicated that the charges will be pursued to the fullest extent of Arizona law. The $2 million bond has remained in place. The defense has indicated that mental health issues will be raised as a factor in mitigation. The Horn family has not made a public statement about the eventual outcome, beyond Jackie's comment that she trusts the system will hold him accountable. What is clear from the public record is that on the morning of September 17, 2025, in a small Mesa apartment near Broadway and Dobson, a mother woke up to the sound of her teenage daughter calling for her, in a voice that no mother ever wants to hear in the middle of the night. She got up. She moved toward that voice. She stepped between the stranger and her daughter. She took stab wounds onto her own body. She suffered a brain bleed and a paralyzed face and blurry vision in one eye. And she still managed to call for help, identify the man, and protect her two daughters. The phrase she used in her interview, "We survived as a family," has been the phrase the case has been remembered by. 3 members of one family had walked through a hallway with a stranger who had come into their home with the intent to take their lives. All 3 of them had walked back out of that hallway, in pain, in shock, but alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story east to a wooded state park in Arkansas, where a mother named Kristen Brink was on a Saturday afternoon family hike with her husband and her 2 young daughters. The trail at Devil's Den State Park is the kind of trail that families have walked for decades. By the end of that afternoon, Kristen would have made the decision to send her 2 daughters running for safety, and she would have walked back into the trees alone to try to reach her husband. She did not come out of those trees again. Case 6. Kristen Brink. It was the late morning of Saturday, July 26, 2025, in the wooded foothills of the Boston Mountains in northwest Arkansas, inside the boundaries of Devil's Den State Park. The kind of state park where families from across the region drive in for the weekend. Pine trees and rocky bluffs, hiking trails that wind through old creek beds and stone formations, picnic tables under the shade of the trees, trail maps stapled to wooden posts at the beginning of every path, the sound of children calling out to each other from the playground areas. Kristen Brink and her husband Clinton Brink had brought their 2 daughters to the park that day for a family hike. Kristen was 41 years old. Clinton was 43. Their daughters, ages 9 and 7, were excited the way most children are excited about a Saturday morning in a state park with their parents. The trail they had chosen was the trail with the most beautiful view. The family had been talking about this hike for weeks. They had packed water bottles. They had packed snacks. They had taken photographs at the trailhead before they started walking. By the early afternoon of that same Saturday, Kristen would be making the decision to send her 2 daughters running back down the trail towards safety, and she would be turning around, alone, to walk back into the trees toward her husband. She would not come back out. Kristen Brink had been a mother in the most full and unmistakable sense of the word. Family members and neighbours who later spoke with national news outlets, including CNN and the Associated Press, described her as the kind of mother whose entire daily life was organised around her 3 daughters. She had a 3rd daughter who was not on the hike that day. She had spent her years raising children with the kind of attention that everyone around her had noticed. The family had recently moved. They had been settling into a new community. The hike at Devil's Den that weekend was the kind of family activity that the Brinks had built their lives around. The kind of weekend that was meant to be, in every sense, ordinary. Clinton Brink, Kristen's husband, was 43 years old. Family members described him as a devoted father, a man who had been on every hike, every camping trip, every school event with his daughters since they had been small. He had built his life around his family the same way Kristen had. The marriage between Kristen and Clinton was the kind of marriage that the people closest to them had described as a true partnership. The kind of marriage that the children had grown up watching. The kind of marriage that had set the rhythm of every other thing in the Brink household. The trail the family chose that morning was one of the most popular at Devil's Den. The kind of path that families with younger children tended to walk together. There were other people at the park that day. Hikers passed each other. Children waved at children. The weather was warm, but not unbearable. There was no warning, by every account that has come out of the case so far, that anything was about to happen. What the Brink family did not know, and what no one at Devil's Den State Park that Saturday morning could have known, was that they were sharing the trail that day with a man named Andrew McGann. McGann was 28 years old. He had moved to Arkansas earlier that year. He had been preparing, according to information later released by the Springdale Public Schools District, to begin a job as an elementary school teacher in the local district. He had no known significant adult criminal history. He had no known connection to the Brink family. He had no apparent reason to have done what he did that day. The investigation, as it has continued through the Arkansas state court system, has not revealed any motive. Investigators have stated repeatedly, in news conferences and in court filings, that the attack on the Brinks appeared to be entirely random. What is known is that, somewhere along the trail that Saturday morning, McGann encountered Clinton Brink. The encounter was sudden. The attack was sudden. McGann was carrying a knife. He attacked Clinton without warning. The attack was severe. By the time the first emergency calls began to come in from other hikers, Clinton was already on the ground. Kristen and the 2 daughters were close enough to see what was happening. The daughters were 9 and 7 years old. They saw their father attacked. They saw a stranger with a knife. They saw their world break in the middle of an ordinary Saturday morning hike. Kristen, in the seconds that followed, made a decision that the Arkansas State Police later described in a press conference as one of the most extraordinary parental decisions they had documented in their long careers. She did not freeze. She did not panic. She turned to her 2 small daughters and she got them moving. She moved them away from their father. She moved them down the trail. She moved them toward the parking area, toward safety, toward other adults who could help them. She got her children far enough away from the attack to give them a real chance of survival. What she did next is the part that has been quoted in every national news article and television report about the case since. She did not go all the way back to the parking lot with her daughters. She turned around. She left her 2 children in the care of other adults at the park. She turned, alone, and walked back up the trail toward where her husband was. She did this with the full knowledge that the man with the knife was still up there. She did this knowing what would likely happen to her if she went back. She did it anyway. As Major Stacy Rhodes of the Arkansas State Police would later say in a press conference, the mother did not return all the way to the car with the kids. She believed, the major said, that the mother had taken the children to safety and had then returned to help her husband. What Kristen found when she reached her husband, what happened in the minutes that followed her return, can only be reconstructed from the physical evidence and from the eventual statements McGann himself made to investigators. Both Clinton and Kristen lost their lives on that trail. Both of them were 43 and 41 years old. Both of them had 3 daughters waiting for them somewhere in the world. The 2 daughters who had been on the trail that day, the 9-year-old and the 7-year-old, were the daughters who, with the help of other adults at the park, told other people in the parking lot what had happened. They were the children who, in the words of state police officials, gave the first description of the man with the knife. The descriptions the daughters gave, even in the worst minutes of their own short lives, were the descriptions that allowed law enforcement to find McGann. McGann had not stayed at the park. He had left the area. The first description of the suspect came from the daughters of the people he had attacked. The Arkansas State Police, working from those descriptions, were able to begin the search for him within the hour. The investigation that followed was rapid. Surveillance and witness reports tracked McGann to a hair salon in Springdale, Arkansas. By the next day, McGann was in custody. According to the probable cause statement filed in court, when officers arrived at the salon, McGann acknowledged that the car parked outside was his. Investigators noticed several cuts on his hands. The car was searched. Blood was found inside it. The probable cause statement notes that, after being provided his Miranda warnings, McGann made statements to investigators indicating that he had committed the 2 homicides. He was arrested on the spot. The surveillance video from the salon, which was later shared with CNN, showed McGann not resisting as he was placed in handcuffs. The court appearances that followed were brief. McGann appeared before a judge wearing a striped jail uniform. He did not speak except to acknowledge his name. A public defender was assigned to him. He was held without bond pending arraignment. The criminal charges, as they have been filed, reflect the severity of what he did on that trail. The Arkansas State Police, the Washington County Sheriff's Office, and the local prosecutor's office have all stated publicly that this was one of the most serious cases they have handled in recent memory. The motive, as of the latest publicly available information, has not been established. McGann had no known relationship to the Brink family. The Brinks had moved to Arkansas earlier in the year and had no apparent connection to McGann. There was no romantic connection. There was no business connection. There was nothing in the public record that connected the attacker to the family in any way. The Arkansas State Police, in repeated public statements, have called the attack a completely random event. The 2 daughters of Kristen and Clinton Brink, the 9-year-old and the 7-year-old, are now being raised by family. There is also a 3rd daughter, who was not at the park that day, who has lost her parents in a matter of one Saturday afternoon. The community in Arkansas, the church the family had begun attending, and the neighbourhoods where the Brinks had been settling in, have all been involved in the support of the surviving children. State police officials have stated that the surviving daughters have very, very strong family support in place and that they would be well taken care of. The story of what Kristen Brink did on that trail at Devil's Den has been quoted many times since. The phrase that has stayed in the public record is the phrase that the Arkansas State Police used about her decision. She had taken the children to safety. She had then turned and gone back. She had not run. She had not let her instinct to protect her own life override her instinct to protect her husband. She had walked back up that trail, knowing what was up there. She had made the choice that in the end, mothers across the country read about and could not put down. The funeral for Kristen and Clinton Brink was held in Arkansas. It was attended by family, by members of the community, by parents from the school district where Clinton had worked, by neighbours who had known the family for the short time they had been in the area. The two daughters who had been on the trail attended the funeral. They had walked into a state park that morning as a family of 4. They had walked back out of it without their parents. The legal case against Andrew McGann has continued through the Arkansas state court system. The proceedings have been long. The investigation has continued to look for any thread that might explain why McGann did what he did. As of the latest publicly available information, the case has progressed toward trial. McGann has remained in custody since the day of his arrest. What stays in the public record about Kristen Brink is not a long list of facts. It is one short sequence of events. A mother on a Saturday morning hike. A stranger on a trail. 2 small daughters who were close enough to see what was happening to their father. A decision in the next several seconds, made by a mother with no time to think about it, that the children would be moved away first. The daughters running down a trail toward the safety of other adults. The mother turning and walking back up the trail in the opposite direction. The trees closing in behind her. Kristen Brink was 41 years old. She was a mother of 3. She walked back into those trees because her husband was still up there. The 2 children she sent running down the trail are still alive. They are living. They are in school. They have grandparents and aunts and uncles around them. They have a 3rd sister who was not at the park that day. The 3 of them, the way the public record now stands, are the inheritors of one of the quietest and most extraordinary acts of motherhood Arkansas has ever recorded. The trail at Devil's Den State Park is still open. People still hike it on Saturday mornings. Most of them do not know what happened there in July of 2025. The 2 girls who were there that day will never forget it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story back across the country to a small home in Petaluma, California, where a mother named Eve Nickel was asleep in the next room, while her 12-year-old daughter Polly Klaas was hosting a slumber party with 2 friends. The man who walked through the bedroom door that night had a knife in his hand. By the time Eve was woken by Polly's 2 friends, her daughter had already been taken out of the house, and the search for her would last almost 2 months. Case 7. Eve Nickel. It was just after 10:30 on the night of Friday, October 1st, 1993, in the small Northern California city of Petaluma. The kind of city that, in the early 1990s, was still small enough that most people knew their neighbours, that local children walked to school, that the front doors of family homes were often left unlocked through the early evening hours. Petaluma sat about 40 miles north of San Francisco, a quiet pocket of Sonoma County. Inside a small home on 4th Street, a mother named Eve Nickel was asleep in her own bedroom. In the bedroom directly next door, her 12-year-old daughter, Polly Hannah Klaas, was hosting a slumber party with 2 of her closest friends. The girls had been playing a board game. They had eaten snacks. They had been laughing the way 12-year-old girls laugh on a Friday night when they have permission to stay up later than usual. The home was warm. The door was locked. Polly's younger sister was asleep in another room. By the time Eve was woken from her sleep by the 2 terrified friends standing at the foot of her bed, her daughter Polly was no longer in the house. The man who had taken her had walked out the front door less than 30 minutes earlier. The search that followed would last almost 2 months. Polly Klaas was, by every photograph and every memory shared by people who knew her, the kind of 12-year-old who lit up a room. She was a 7th grader at Petaluma Junior High School. She had long, dark hair. She loved theatre. She had played a lead role in a school adaptation of Where on Earth is Carmen Sandiego, only months before the night she was taken. She had wanted to be an actress. According to her father, Mark Klaas, who would later become one of the most prominent child safety advocates in the United States, she had a special gift for performing. She was kind. She was quietly funny. She had read Little Women more than once. She had loved Shakespeare. She had been 12 years old. Eve Nickel was Polly's mother. She had been separated from Polly's father for most of Polly's life. Mark Klaas lived in a different home in another part of California. Polly had been spending the weekend at her mother's house in Petaluma. Eve had remarried a man named Alan Nickel, and Polly had a younger sister, Annie, who was 6 years old at the time. The home on 4th Street was the home Polly had grown up in. Eve was the kind of mother who allowed her 12-year-old daughter to invite her 2 best friends for a Friday night slumber party. There had been no reason, by every standard a mother holds in her head about her own home, to think that anything was about to happen. Polly's 2 friends had been to that house many times before. They had been playing the board game Perfect Match on the floor of Polly's bedroom. The lights had been on. The door had been closed. According to the eventual statements both girls would give to investigators, they had heard the bedroom door open at about 10:30 in the evening. They had looked up expecting to see Eve. What they had seen instead was a stranger. The man standing in the doorway was a 40-year-old career criminal named Richard Allen Davis. He had a long history of arrests. He had been in and out of correctional facilities since his late teens. He had been released on parole only months before that Friday night. He had been drinking. He had walked into the small home on 4th Street through a door that had been left unlocked, and he had walked from room to room until he had found the room with the 3 girls in it. He was holding a knife he had taken from the kitchen on his way through. The man told the girls not to scream. He told them he was there for money, that he was not going to hurt them. He tied both of Polly's friends with strips of fabric. He placed pillowcases over their heads. He asked which of the 3 girls lived in the house. Polly answered. He took her with him. Before he left the bedroom, he told the 2 friends to count to 1,000 before they tried to do anything. The 2 girls, who were 11 and 12 years old, did exactly what he told them to do. They sat in a room with pillowcases over their heads and counted, in the dark, while a man none of them had ever seen before in their lives walked their best friend out of the house. Eve Nickel was asleep through every minute of this. Her bedroom was just on the other side of the wall. There was no commotion loud enough to wake her. The man had moved through the house quickly and quietly. He had made his way out the back door, with Polly, into the cool October night air. By the time the 2 friends had counted to 1,000 and managed to free themselves, Polly had been gone for somewhere around 20 minutes. The 2 girls came out of the bedroom. They went into the room where Eve was sleeping. They woke her up. They told her, in whatever broken way 2 terrified girls could tell a mother, that a man had come into the house, that he had tied them up, and that he had taken Polly. Eve was on her feet before the words had fully come out of their mouths. She ran to Polly's bedroom. The bed was empty. Polly was not anywhere in the house. The 911 call that Eve placed at that moment is one of the recordings that has been preserved in the long public record of the case. She tells the dispatcher, "Apparently a man just broke into our house and took my daughter." The disbelief in her voice is something that has stayed in the recording for more than 30 years. The Sonoma County Sheriff's Department arrived within minutes. The local Petaluma Police Department was already on its way. Officers fanned out through the neighborhood. The All Points Bulletin went out. What no one in the home knew at that moment was that, less than 2 hours after Polly had been taken, a different police agency in Sonoma County had already encountered the man responsible for her abduction. A property owner named Dana Jaffe, who lived on a long, secluded driveway in Santa Rosa, about an hour from Petaluma, had called police at around midnight to report a suspicious car stuck in a ditch on her private driveway. 2 Sonoma County deputies had responded. The man with the car had been disheveled and reeked, in Jaffe's later words. The deputies had checked his identification, helped him pull his car out of the ditch, and let him drive away. They had not received the all-points bulletin about the abduction in Petaluma because the bulletin had been broadcast on a different police radio frequency. The 2 officers had no idea that the man they had just helped had Polly Klaas hidden in the woods next to that same driveway. What that means, and what has stayed in the public record as the single most painful detail of the entire case, is that for the next several hours of that night, Polly Klaas was still alive. She was still alive while her mother sat in the kitchen of the home on 4th Street with police officers asking questions. She was still alive while Mark Klaas was being woken up by a phone call he did not want to receive. The decisions made on Dana Jaffe's secluded driveway, in the dark, with imperfect information and a missing radio bulletin, were the decisions that meant the search for Polly would last almost 2 more months. Eve Nichols spent every one of those days at the centre of a national news story. Her photograph, holding a picture of her daughter, ran on the cover of magazines. She gave interviews to local and national news. She stood next to her ex-husband Mark and her current husband Alan and pleaded for the safe return of her child. The town of Petaluma came together around the search. Volunteers ran the search effort. Posters of Polly were distributed across the country. Actress Winona Ryder, who had grown up in Petaluma, offered a $200,000 reward for any information leading to Polly's safe return. President Bill Clinton commented on the case. Polly's face was on every late-night news broadcast. Eve was right there, on the screen, every time. What Eve was experiencing during those weeks was the kind of grief that does not yet know if it is grief. She had no information. She had no remains to bury. She had no certainty about whether her daughter was still alive. She had a 6-year-old younger daughter, Annie, who was now growing up overnight in a household that no longer functioned the way it had before. The break in the case came from Dana Jaffe. On November 27, 1993, Jaffe was hiking on her own property with a friend. She came across a torn pair of girls' red ballet tights, a sweatshirt, and a knotted piece of white fabric. She called the police. The detectives recognized the white fabric as the same kind that had been used to tie up the 2 friends in Polly's bedroom. They went back through the records of suspicious vehicle reports from the night of the abduction. They found the report Jaffe herself had filed. They cross-checked the driver's license name. The name was Richard Allen Davis. Davis was a parolee. His fingerprints were on file. The detectives had also recovered a partial palm print from Polly's bedroom. The 2 prints matched. Davis was arrested on November 30th, 1993. Under questioning, Davis eventually confessed to the abduction. He led investigators to a remote field outside the small town of Cloverdale. There, in a shallow grave, the search for Polly Klaas came to an end. She had not survived the same night she had been taken from her bedroom. Eve Nichols learned that her daughter was no longer alive on a Saturday in early December 1993. The town of Petaluma went into mourning. The 2 friends who had been at the slumber party had to live with what they had heard and what they had not been able to stop. The younger sister, Annie, had to grow up in a home where the bedroom next to her mother's would never be used the same way again. The trial of Richard Allen Davis began in 1996. It was held in San Jose because the publicity around the case had made it impossible to seat a fair jury in Sonoma County. Davis was convicted of first-degree murder with 4 special circumstances including kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and an attempted lewd act on a child. The jury voted unanimously for the death penalty. At his formal sentencing, Davis taunted the courtroom by extending both middle fingers at a courtroom camera. He made a statement implying that Polly's last words had been about her father. Mark Klaas, in the courtroom, lunged at him and had to be escorted out. The judge who imposed the death sentence told Davis that his behaviour in the courtroom had made the decision easier than it should have been. Davis has remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison ever since. He is now in his early 70s. He will most likely die in custody of natural causes, having spent more years on death row then Polly Klaas was alive. The case of Polly Klaas changed American law. The 3 strikes laws that swept across multiple states in the mid-1990s were passed in large part because of the public outrage over the fact that Davis had been on parole at the time of the abduction. The Polly Klaas Foundation, founded by Mark Klaas in his daughter's memory, has helped tens of thousands of families search for missing children. The Amber Alert system, the Megan's Law sex offender registries, and the modern federal infrastructure for responding to child abduction were all, in one way or another, shaped by the case that began in a small bedroom in Petaluma on the first day of October in 1993. Eve Nickel has, in the more than 3 decades since the night her daughter was taken, mostly stayed out of the public eye. Mark Klaas has been the public voice of the family for most of those years. Eve has continued to live a quiet life. She has raised her younger daughter Annie. She has been described by people close to the family as the kind of mother who, even after the worst thing that could happen to a mother had already happened to her, kept trying to be a mother to the child who was still in the house. The home on 4th Street has changed hands. The bedroom where the slumber party took place has belonged to other people for many years now. The town of Petaluma still has a community theatre named in Polly's honour. It reopened in November of 2022 after years of fundraising and renovation. 12-year-old children still walk into it for auditions. The mother who once heard 2 girls run into her bedroom in the middle of the night has lived with that moment for more than 30 years. Polly would have been 42 years old in 2025. She is still 12. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story southeast to the woods around Lake Seminole on the border of Florida and Georgia, where a mother named Cheryl Williams was about to spend almost 2 decades of her life refusing to accept the official version of what had happened to her son. Mike Williams went duck hunting on his 6th wedding anniversary and never came home. The police told Cheryl he had probably been taken by alligators. She did not believe them, and the 2,000 handwritten letters she sent over the next 17 years are the only reason the truth ever surfaced. Case 8. Cheryl Williams. It was the dark before sunrise on Saturday morning, December 16, 2000, in Tallahassee, Florida. The kind of late autumn morning in North Florida, where the air is still cool, the sky has not yet begun to lighten, and the only sound on a quiet residential street is the hum of a single truck pulling a small boat trailer down the driveway. The man behind the wheel was a 31-year-old real estate appraiser named Jerry Michael Williams, known to everyone in his life as Mike. He had loaded his shotgun, his decoys, and his hunting gear into the boat the night before. He was driving an hour and a half west to Lake Seminole, a long, flat reservoir that runs along the border between Florida and Georgia, where he had been duck hunting since he was 15. His wife Denise was asleep in their bed. Their 18-month-old daughter Ansley was asleep in her crib. Mike had told Denise the night before that he would be home by lunchtime. They had a 6th wedding anniversary to celebrate. They had reservations at a hotel in the small coastal town of Apalachicola. He had pulled out of the driveway just before 5 in the morning. By noon, he would not have come home. The only person on earth who refused to accept the official version of what had happened to him was his mother. Her name was Cheryl Williams. Her 2,000 handwritten letters are the only reason her son's story did not stay buried for the rest of her life. Cheryl Williams was an ordinary North Florida mother. She had worked her whole adult life. Her husband had been a Greyhound bus driver. She had worked at a local daycare. She had raised 2 sons, Mike and his older brother Nick, on the kind of family income that did not stretch to vacations, but did stretch to private Christian school tuition for both boys. She had attended every football game. She had lived in the same area of Tallahassee for most of her adult life. Her son Mike had grown up to become a real estate appraiser, earning almost $200,000 a year by the time he was 31. He had become a husband and a father. Mike Williams was the kind of man people described in the same way every time. A devoted father, a hard worker, the kind of husband who came home from a full day at the office, ate dinner with his wife and his baby daughter, put the baby down for the night, and then drove back to his office to keep working through the night. He had played football in high school. He had been the student council president. He had met a cheerleader named Denise Merrill in 10th grade. The two of them had been inseparable through high school. They had attended Florida State University together. They had married in 1994. He treated his daughter Ansley as the center of his world. He was the kind of man who did not have an enemy in the world. He also had a $1 million life insurance policy on himself, taken out less than a year before he disappeared. The policy had been sold to him by his closest friend in the world, an insurance agent named Brian Winchester. Mike trusted Brian with everything. Their two families spent holidays together. Their wives were close friends. Mike, by every detail of the friendship as it later came out in court, did not have a single reason to be anything but grateful that his closest friend was the one handling his insurance. What Mike did not know, and what would only come out almost 2 decades later, was that Brian Winchester and Mike's wife Denise had been having an affair since 1997. The affair had been going on for over 3 years by December 2000. The two couples had continued to take family trips together, while Brian and Denise were sleeping with each other on the side. Denise's family was deeply religious and looked down on divorce. She had told Brian she could never publicly leave Mike. She had also told Brian that if she divorced Mike, she would lose joint custody of her daughter. The two of them had decided that the only way for them to be together was if Mike was no longer alive. The morning Mike left for his duck hunting trip, Brian Winchester met him at Lake Seminole. Brian had told Mike about a secret hunting spot only the two of them would know about. He had told Mike to wear his waders, the heavy waterproof rubber pants that go up to the chest. Once the two of them were out in the boat in deep water, Brian shoved Mike overboard. The plan was that the heavy, water-filled waders would drag Mike down to the bottom of the lake. The disappearance would look like an ordinary hunting accident. Mike did not go down. He kicked off the waders. He swam to a tree stump sticking out of the water and held on. He cried out for help. He looked at his best friend in the boat and called for him by name. According to Brian's eventual confession, Brian had brought a shotgun for exactly this contingency. He circled the boat around Mike twice. He raised the shotgun. He fired. He pulled the body into the boat. He drove home with Mike's body in his truck. He buried his best friend in a remote dry creek bed near a place called Carr Lake, almost an hour from Lake Seminole. He went home to his wife and got back into bed beside her, so he would have an alibi. Then later that day, when the search began, he showed up to help look for Mike. He hugged Denise. He hugged Cheryl. He pretended to be a worried friend. By that afternoon, Mike's truck and boat trailer had been found at a remote boat launch on the Florida side of Lake Seminole. The boat was found floating empty along the shoreline. His shotgun was still in the boat. His decoys were still in the boat. There was no sign of Mike. The state of Florida ordered one of the largest water searches in its history. Helicopters circled the lake. Divers swept the bottom. They searched for 44 straight days. They found nothing. By February 2001, the official search had been called off. The most popular theory among investigators was that his body had sunk into the thick weeds at the bottom of the lake and been taken by alligators. Cheryl Williams heard this theory in February 2001. She did not believe a single word of it. Cheryl knew her son. She knew that Lake Seminole was a cold water lake in winter. She knew that alligators rarely fed in cold weather. She also knew that out of the 80 known drowning deaths recorded at Lake Seminole over the years, every single one of them had eventually been recovered. Everyone except her son. The math did not add up. The fact that her daughter-in-law Denise had not seemed particularly interested in pushing for a deeper investigation did not add up either. In June 2001, 4 months after the search had been called off, an angler fishing at Lake Seminole found a pair of waders floating on the surface. Divers were sent back down. They recovered a hunting jacket, a flashlight, and Mike's hunting license inside the jacket pocket. The waders had no teeth marks. None of the items had the kind of damage you would expect from being underwater for 6 months. They looked like they had been freshly placed there. What no one knew at the time was that Brian Winchester had returned and dropped the items in the lake himself. The trick worked. Based on those items, a Florida judge declared Mike legally dead. Denise filed her insurance paperwork. She received approximately $1.75 million in life insurance payouts. The man who had sold her one of those policies was sleeping in her bed. Cheryl Williams did not stop. From the moment the alligator theory had been floated, she had been writing letters. She wrote to local newspapers, law enforcement, every Florida state senator, and every governor of Florida who held the office during the years her son's case sat dormant. Beginning in 2009, she began writing to Governor Rick Scott every single day. She wrote in her own handwriting, on simple stationery, the same kind of letter, with slight variations. She told the governor that her son had not been taken by alligators. She told the governor that her son had been killed. She told the governor that the people responsible were still walking free. By the time the case finally cracked open, she had written nearly 2,000 of these letters. She wore a t-shirt to court every day with her son's face printed on it. She gave interviews to anyone who would listen. She stood outside courthouses with photographs of Mike. She approached state attorneys at public events. She did not raise her voice. She did not break down. She did the same thing every day for almost a decade and a half. She refused to let her son become a closed file. In 2005, Denise Williams married Brian Winchester. Denise's daughter, Ansley, who had been an infant on the morning of her father's last hunting trip, grew up calling Brian her stepfather. Cheryl, in later interviews, described that as the cruelest part. Her granddaughter was being raised in the home of the man Cheryl believed had taken her son. The Winchester marriage fell apart by 2012. Brian started using substances. By 2015, Denise had filed for divorce. Brian could not handle losing her. In August 2016, he climbed into the back seat of Denise's car at a parking lot in Tallahassee. When she got into the driver's seat, he pressed a firearm into her ribs. He drove her around Tallahassee for almost 2 hours, begging her not to divorce him. Denise eventually escaped. She called the police. Brian was arrested. In Florida, married people cannot be forced to testify against each other. Brian's kidnapping arrest changed everything. He was facing decades in a correctional facility. Investigators offered him a deal. If he confessed to ending Mike Williams' life and told them where the body was, they would not charge him with the most serious counts in Mike's case. Brian Winchester took the deal. He led detectives to a dry creek bed off a dead-end road called Gardner Road. He pointed at a patch of dirt. They dug. They found the bones of Jerry Michael Williams, exactly where Brian had buried him almost 17 years before. Cheryl Williams was at home in Tallahassee when she got the phone call. Her son's bones had been found. The alligator story, the story she had refused to accept for almost 2 decades, was officially over. The 2,000 letters she had written had not been written into a void. They had been read. They had kept the case alive long enough for the kidnapping to crack it open. Brian Winchester was sentenced to 20 years for the kidnapping of Denise. In May 2018, Denise Williams was arrested for the killing of her husband. Her trial began in December 2018. Brian took the witness stand against her. He described the entire plan. He called the affair the start of everything. He called himself and Denise partners. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Denise Williams was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and being an accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to life behind bars. In 2020, a Florida appeals court overturned the murder conviction on a narrow legal technicality, but kept the conspiracy conviction in place. Denise is currently serving a 30-year sentence for plotting her husband's death. Brian Winchester remains in custody on his kidnapping sentence. The man who actually pulled the trigger on Mike Williams will be released from his sentence before the woman who told him to do it. Mike's mother, Cheryl, finally got the funeral she had been waiting for. She arranged a real burial for him at Rose Lawn Cemetery in Tallahassee. His daughter Ansley, by then 19 years old, attended the service. The girl had spent her entire childhood being told her father had been taken by alligators. She had grown up calling his killer her stepfather. By the time she stood at her father's graveside, she was nearly an adult. She had never really known her father at all. Cheryl has continued to speak publicly about the case. She has appeared in documentaries. She has spoken to true crime podcasts. She has shown reporters the boxes of letter copies she kept over the years. She has talked about what it took, as a working-class mother in North Florida, to refuse to let the most powerful institutions in her state close the file on her child. What stays in the public record about Cheryl Williams is something that does not appear in most true crime case histories. The 2,000 letters, the t-shirts with her son's face on them, the single mother of Tallahassee who simply did not accept the official explanation, the mother who lived through every chapter of the catastrophic violence done to her family at a distance, never being in the room where it happened, but never leaving the case alone for a single one of the 17 years that followed. Her son Mike Williams is buried in Tallahassee, under a stone that does not mention alligators. The story of how he got there is the story of a mother with a pen and a stack of envelopes, and the kind of stubbornness that does not exist in any law enforcement training manual on Earth. Mike Williams would have been 56 years old in 2025. He is at rest in Tallahassee because his mother put him there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story westward to a stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway in Mendocino County, California, where a biological mother named Tammy Shurik had spent 12 years not knowing where her 3 adopted children were. The phone call she received in October 2018 told her that all 3 of them, along with 3 other adopted siblings and their 2 adoptive parents, had gone over a 100-foot cliff into the ocean 6 months earlier. She had not been told for half a year that her children were already gone. Case 9. Tammy Shurik. It was a quiet evening in October 2018 in a small home in Texas when a phone rang. The woman who answered the phone had not heard the voice on the other end of the line in many years. The voice belonged to her stepmother. The 2 of them had been estranged. The call was unexpected. The stepmother on the other end of the line was calling because a journalist had reached out to her earlier that week, asking questions about 3 children who had once been hers. The stepmother, after some hesitation, had agreed to pass the message along. The woman on the receiving end of the call was named Tammy Shurik. She was the biological mother of 3 children she had not raised, 3 children she had voluntarily given up parental rights to 14 years before, 3 children she had assumed for over a decade were living somewhere in Texas with a foster family who had wanted to adopt them. The stepmother had not called to tell her where her children were. The stepmother had called to tell her that her children, along with 3 other adopted siblings and their 2 adoptive parents, had driven off a 100-foot cliff in California 6 months earlier. Marcus was already gone. Hannah was already gone. Abigail was already gone. The youngest had been 12 years old. The oldest had been 19. Tammy Shurik, the biological mother of 3 of those 6 children, was now learning of their deaths from a stepmother she had not spoken to in years, half a year after the cliff. Tammy Shurik had been a young mother in Texas in the early 2000s. She had been struggling in the way that many young mothers in working-class Texas neighborhoods have struggled. The kind of struggle that is not visible from the outside. The kind that comes from a series of small decisions and small misfortunes that add up over years. The kind that ends in a courtroom where parental rights are signed away. In the summer of 2004, she had been convinced by caseworkers in the Texas child welfare system that the best thing she could do for her 3 children, Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail, was to sign over her parental rights. She was told the children would be placed with a foster family in Missouri City, a suburb of Houston. She was told the foster family wanted to adopt them. She had signed the papers. She had given up her 3 children, in her own understanding, to a Texas family she would not be allowed to contact, raising her children in the same state where she herself was still living. That was the deal she thought she had made. What actually happened was different. The Missouri City foster family adoption never went through. 2 years later, in 2006, the 3 Shurik children were sent more than 1,000 miles away from Texas to a couple in Minnesota named Jennifer and Sarah Hart. Tammy was never informed of this. Her parental rights had already been terminated. Under Texas law, no one was required to tell her where her children had ended up. The children themselves, ages 7, 4, and 3 at the time of the adoption, were too young to understand what had happened to them. They had been moved from a foster facility to the Hart's home in Alexandria, Minnesota, and from that point forward, the 3 Shurik children had become Marcus Hart, Hannah Hart, and Abigail Hart. Jennifer Hart and Sarah Hart were a married couple. Both of them had grown up in South Dakota. Both of them had attended Northern State University. Sarah had majored in elementary education with a focus on special education. The two of them had moved to Minnesota together in the mid-2000s, where they had eventually adopted Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail through the Texas system. 3 years later, in 2009, they had adopted 3 more children, all biological siblings to each other, but not to the first 3. Those children were Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. Their biological mother was a different woman named Sherry Davis, who had also lost her parental rights through a state child welfare system, in her case in Texas as well. By the early 2000s, the Hart household had become, on its public face, a picture of progressive American family life. The two mothers posted regularly on social media, photographs of the 6 children, all of colour, smiling in matching t-shirts, holding hand-painted signs that said, "Love is always beautiful," became part of a regular feed that thousands of strangers followed. The family attended music festivals. The family went on road trips. The family appeared, by every visible signal on the internet, to be a happy and unconventional success story. Behind that public face, however, there were already cracks. As early as 2008, while the family was still living in Minnesota, a teacher noticed bruises on Hannah's arm. Hannah, who was 6 years old at the time, told the teacher that Jennifer had hit her with a belt. The Harts told the police that Hannah had fallen down the stairs. No charges were filed. In 2010, after the family had moved to Oregon, Abigail told classmates that she had been beaten by her mothers. She had bruises, she said, had come from being held under cold water. Sarah Hart pleaded guilty to assault. She was sentenced to a year of community service. The story the Harts gave to the public was that Hannah had been the one who had really done it, that Sarah had taken the blame to protect her. In 2013, in Washington State, where the family had moved next, neighbours began noticing that the Hart children would sometimes come to their door at night asking for food. Devontae, in particular, became known to the neighbours as the boy who would come over and ask for food and beg the neighbours not to tell his mothers. The neighbours began to call child welfare. Multiple welfare checks were called in. The Harts always managed to present a clean enough surface to keep the caseworkers from acting. By March 2018, the situation in the Hart household had deteriorated past the point that even the careful public face could hide. A neighbour in Woodland, Washington, named Bruce DeKalb, and his wife Dana, had become close enough to Devontae that the boy was coming to their home daily. Devontae had told the DeKalbs, in pieces, that the children in the house were not being fed. He had begged them for food. The DeKalbs had begun feeding him regularly. On March 23, 2018, Dana DeKalb finally called Child Protective Services. She told them what Devontae had been telling her. CPS told her they would investigate. The next morning, March 24th, Jennifer and Sarah Hart packed all 6 children into their GMC Yukon. They drove out of Washington. They started heading south. Surveillance footage from a Safeway in Fort Bragg, California, captured Jennifer Hart on March 25th, buying bananas and other groceries. The family stayed in the Fort Bragg area through that night. On the afternoon of March 26, 2018, just after 3:30 in the afternoon, a passerby on California Highway 1 near the cliffs of Mendocino County saw a vehicle upside down on the rocks 100 feet below the road. The vehicle was the Hart's GMC Yukon. When investigators eventually pieced together what had happened, the picture they reconstructed was almost impossible to process. Jennifer had been in the driver's seat. Sarah had been in the front passenger seat. Jennifer had pulled the SUV off the highway onto a gravel turnout near the edge of the cliff. She had stopped the vehicle about 70 feet from the edge. She had then accelerated the vehicle from a complete stop to between 20 and 90 miles per hour, with the throttle at 100%. She had not touched the brake. There were no skid marks on the gravel. The SUV had gone off the cliff at full speed and fallen 100 feet onto the rocks below. None of the people inside it were wearing seat belts. Jennifer's blood alcohol level was over the legal limit. Sarah and 2 of the children had antihistamines in their systems. As the SUV had been driving down Highway 1, Sarah had been on her phone, searching online for the lethality of certain over-the-counter medications and the nature of certain kinds of death. One of her last searches had been for a no-kill animal shelter for the family dogs. A coroner's jury later unanimously ruled the case a murder-suicide. Jennifer and Sarah had taken their own lives, along with the lives of their 6 children. There was no possibility of criminal prosecution because both parents were already gone. Marcus was 19, Hannah was 16, Devontae was 15, Jeremiah was 14, Abigail was 14, Sierra was 12. 3 of the children were Tammy Shurik's biological children. 3 were Sherry Davis's biological children. None of them had been protected by the system that was supposed to protect them. Tammy Shurik learned all of this in October 2018. She learned it from her stepmother. The stepmother had been contacted by a journalist who was working on a long investigative piece for The Appeal, a publication that covers the American legal system, who had gotten the family name Shurik from a passel of records released by the Clark County, Washington Sheriff's Office in September 2018. The journalist had tracked down the stepmother on Facebook. The stepmother had then called Tammy. That was how Tammy found out. 6 months had passed since the cliff. 6 months in which her 3 biological children had been written about in newspapers across the country. 6 months in which their faces had been on the cover of Time magazine. 6 months in which Tammy Shurik had been at her job in Texas with no idea that her children were already gone. In her later interviews with The Appeal, Tammy described her reaction to the phone call in plain words. She said, "Those are my children." She said, "This was not supposed to happen." She had spent 12 years assuming that her children were living a quiet life with a Texas family in Missouri City. She had spent 12 years not knowing they had been moved to Minnesota. She had spent 12 years not knowing about the abuse allegations. She had spent 12 years not knowing about the welfare checks. She had spent 6 months of those 12 years not knowing that her children had already gone over a cliff. She was not the only biological mother in this position. Sherry Davis, the mother of Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra, was in the same position. She also had not been notified. The 2 biological mothers, who had never met each other, had been left in the dark for half a year, while the rest of the country had been processing the case in headlines and primetime documentaries. The legal explanation for why Tammy had not been told was simple. The sheriff's offices in Mendocino County, California, and Clark County, Washington, were the agencies investigating the case. Neither of them had any legal obligation to notify a biological parent whose parental rights had already been terminated. Vivek Sankaran, a child welfare reform advocate and law professor at the University of Michigan Law School, told The Appeal that he was not aware of any law that required anything like notification once parental rights had been terminated. The system did not consider Tammy Shurik, in October 2018, a person who needed to be informed. Tammy's grief, in the years that followed, has been quiet. She has not become a public advocate. She has not held news conferences. She has spoken sparingly, mostly to The Appeal, mostly to a small handful of journalists who have continued to follow the long aftermath of the Hart family case. She has spoken about a daughter she lost contact with at the age of 3, who, by the time the cliff happened, had been a teenager Tammy would not have recognized in a photograph. She has spoken about the impossibility of grieving children she had not seen since they were small. She has spoken about the fact that when her older surviving daughters needed to know their family medical history later, the records were not there to help them. because Tammy did not know what had happened to them in the years she had been kept in the dark. The case of the Hart family is a case in which a mother lived through the catastrophic violence done to her children at a distance no one in human history had ever had to face before. Tammy was not in the SUV. Tammy was not at the cliff. Tammy did not even know the cliff had happened until the second wave of national news coverage had already passed. She was the kind of survivor whose survival had been granted to her by the silence of the system around her. She had been the absent witness, the witness who had been informed of the deaths of her children through a stepmother she had not spoken to in years. What stays in the public record about Tammy Shurik is not a list of letters or a courtroom statement or a moment of physical bravery. It is the picture of a Texas mother who, after 12 years of not knowing, found out from a Facebook message that her 3 children had gone off a cliff in California half a year earlier. It is the picture of a system that did not consider her worth a phone call. It is the picture of 3 children, Marcus and Hannah and Abigail, who had grown up not knowing they had a biological mother in Texas, who had assumed for over a decade that they were safe in Missouri City. It is the picture of a cliff in Mendocino County that, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2018, became the resting place of 3 children who had been born to Tammy Shurik and who had ended their short lives with a different last name in a different state because of a series of decisions that had been made for them and not by them, and not by the woman who had given birth to them. The Hart family murders changed national conversations about the adoption system. The case has been the subject of multiple documentaries. Federal officials in the wake of the cliff have pointed out that there is still no national database for child abuse allegations. 5 different states had been involved with the Hart adoptions and abuse reports over the years. 5 different state systems had failed. The children had passed through multiple jurisdictions, multiple welfare checks, multiple police calls, and the only person who had finally pushed the case across a line had been a neighbour in Washington who had been giving Devontae food at her own back door. Tammy Shurik has not given many interviews since 2019. She has spoken about wanting some peace. She has spoken about the impossibility of knowing what to do with the photographs she had not been allowed to take. The cliff at Mendocino County is still there. It still draws tourists. Most of the people who pass it on Highway 1 do not know what happened there in March of 2018. Tammy Shurik knows. She did not see it. She did not hear it. She did not know it had happened until October. She has lived every day since then as the mother who was kept out of the room while her children's story ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story to suburban Pennsylvania in the summer of 1980, where a young mother named Loretta Tot was about to be shot in the head by an assassin hired by her own husband. Her 4-year-old son Anthony was in the home and witnessed the attack on her. Loretta would survive the bullet. She would go on to remarry. She would raise her son. Decades later, that same son would grow up to take the lives of his own wife and 3 children in Florida, in a case that shocked the nation. Case 10. Loretta Tot. It was the summer of 1980 in the suburban Philadelphia community of Bensalem, Pennsylvania, the kind of suburb where school teachers lived in modest homes on tree-lined streets, where children rode bicycles in cul-de-sacs, where the late afternoon sound on a July Tuesday was the sound of a sprinkler running over a small front lawn. Inside one of those homes lived a family that, on every visible surface, looked like the kind of family that quiet Philadelphia suburbs were built around. The husband was a young special education teacher at Bensalem High School. His name was Robert Tot. He was 28 years old. He had a steady paycheck, a quiet wife, a 4-year-old son named Anthony, and a reputation in the school district for being a hard-working, kind, dedicated teacher to children with disabilities. His wife was named Loretta Tot. She was in her late 20s. She was a stay-at-home mother. Their son Anthony was 4 years old. He had bright eyes and a soft voice, and an unmistakable bond with his mother. The summer of 1980 was the summer he would witness his mother shot in the head by a stranger his father had paid to kill her. Loretta Tot would survive that bullet. She would live to remarry, to raise Anthony, and to watch him grow into a husband and a father of his own. What she could not have known, in the summer of 1980, was that the 4-year-old son who had watched her get shot by a man his father had hired would grow up to take the lives of his own wife and his own 3 children in Florida almost 40 years later. Loretta Tot had married Robert Tot in the early 1970s. She had been young. She had been the kind of woman, by every account from extended family who later spoke about the case, who had wanted a quiet domestic life. She had wanted children. She had wanted a home. She had married a man who was, on his public surface, the kind of man a young Pennsylvania woman in the early 1970s would have been proud to marry. Robert was a teacher. He had a steady job. He worked with children who needed extra support. He went to work every morning in a button-down shirt and tie. He was, on every visible measurement, exactly what he appeared to be. What Loretta did not know, and what she would not learn until the case unfolded in court, was that her husband had been carrying on an affair. The woman with whom Robert had been involved was someone outside the marriage, and Robert had decided by the spring of 1980 that he wanted to leave Loretta and marry his mistress. He had also decided that a divorce was not the route he was willing to take. A divorce, in 1980, would have been expensive. A divorce would have been public. A divorce would have meant a custody battle over Anthony. A divorce, by Robert Todd's calculation, was a more difficult exit from his marriage than the alternative he had begun considering instead. The alternative he chose was that he would have his wife killed. Robert Tot did not have any criminal contacts. He was a special education teacher. He did not know anyone in the underworld of Philadelphia. What he did have, however, was access through his job to the brother of one of his former students. Robert had taught a young man with a disability whose older brother was a teenage boy. The teenager had a reputation, even at that age, of being willing to do things other teenagers would not do. Robert had begun a quiet conversation with the older brother that summer. The conversation eventually became a transaction. Robert offered him money. The teenager agreed to take the contract. The terms of the contract, which would later come out in detail at the trial, were specific. Robert had given the teenager strict orders. The teenager was to take the life of Loretta, and Loretta only. He was not to harm the 4-year-old Anthony in the home, no matter what the boy saw. He was simply to walk in, do what he had been paid to do, and leave. The night the attack happened in 1980, Loretta was in the home with her son. Anthony was 4 years old. The teenager entered the home. He had a firearm. He confronted Loretta. He raised the firearm. He fired 1 round into her head. Anthony saw it happen. Anthony was 4 years old. The image of his mother being shot by a stranger in her own home in the summer of 1980 in their family's quiet Bensalem suburb would be the image he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The teenager, having done what he had been paid to do, left the home. Loretta lay on the floor of her own house with a bullet wound in her head, and her 4-year-old son stood near her, in shock, staring at his mother who was no longer moving in the way mothers move. What the teenager did not understand, and what Robert Tot had not anticipated, was that Loretta had not been killed. The bullet had entered her skull, but it had not done what a bullet to the head usually does. She was alive. She was unconscious. She was bleeding badly, but she was alive. The neighbours and emergency services arrived. Loretta was rushed to a hospital. The doctors fought for her. They saved her life. She came out of surgery with damage that would stay with her for years, but she was alive. The investigation that followed unravelled the contract within days. Robert Tot had not covered his tracks well. The connection between him and the teenager was traceable. The financial arrangement was traceable. The mistress was traceable. By July of 1980, Robert Tot had been arrested. He had been charged with hiring an assassin to take the life of his own wife. He was tried and convicted. He was sentenced to a term of 5 to 10 years in a Pennsylvania correctional facility. The 17-year-old who had pulled the trigger was also convicted and sentenced. The Ben Salem community, which had known Robert as the quiet special education teacher, was left to absorb the fact that one of their own had paid a teenager to take the life of his own wife. Loretta Tot walked out of the hospital. She walked back into a house she could no longer live in. She filed for divorce from Robert. She did not stay in the same neighborhood. She moved away from Ben Salem. She rebuilt her life, slowly. She remarried in the years that followed, a man who had no connection to her first marriage. She raised Anthony. She did not tell him in the early years every detail of what had happened in their home. She did not need to. He had been there. He had seen it. He had been 4 years old in 1980, but the brain of a 4-year-old who has seen his mother shot in the head does not forget what it has seen. Robert Tot was released from custody after serving his sentence. He went on to live the rest of his life largely out of the public eye. Loretta did the same, in a different direction. She raised her son. She watched him grow up. He went to high school in Connecticut, in the small town of Montville, where Loretta had remarried and resettled. He met a girl in 10th grade named Megan Denise Gula. The two of them began dating. They graduated from Montville High School. They both attended Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. They both earned master's degrees in physical therapy. They married in 2000. They opened a physical therapy clinic together in Colchester, Connecticut. They had 3 children together over the next several years. The oldest was a son named Alec. The middle was a son named Tyler. The youngest was a daughter named Zoe. Anthony Tot, the 4-year-old who had watched his mother get shot in the head by a stranger his father had paid to kill her, had grown up. He had become a husband and a father. Loretta watched all of this happen. She had grandchildren. She had a daughter-in-law in Megan. She had the kind of family life that, in the early 2000s, looked like the quiet suburban life she had once tried to build for herself with Robert. The trauma of 1980 was not gone. It would never be gone. But she had built something else on top of it. She had survived. She had remarried. She had raised her son. She had become a grandmother to 3 children she loved. By 2017, however, something began to shift in Anthony Tot's household. Megan, his wife, contracted what was later identified as Lyme disease after a tick bite during a family trip to Walt Disney World. She suffered bouts of depression in the years that followed. The Tot family eventually decided to move part of their life to Florida. They settled in a small master-planned community called Celebration in Osceola County, Florida. Anthony continued to work in Connecticut at the clinic and would visit the family weekly. The split living arrangement was unusual. It also turned out to be financially disastrous. In April 2019, federal investigators discovered that Anthony Tot had been billing patients at his clinic for care they had never received. The fraud was significant. He had been using the excess money to pay for the family home in Florida and for trips to Disney World. He had also taken out additional loans from firms in New York City who had begun suing him for failure to pay. By the end of 2019, Tot was over $100,000 in debt. The federal warrant for healthcare fraud charges was about to come to his door. In the last days of 2019 and the first days of January 2020, what happened inside the Tot family home in Celebration, Florida, was something no investigator who eventually walked through the door of that home will ever forget. On December 29, 2019, Osceola County deputies performed an initial welfare check on the home. They received no response from inside and left. On January 9, 2020, federal investigators issuing the fraud warrant raided Anthony Tot's physical therapy clinic in Colchester, Connecticut. He was not there. He was at the family home in Celebration. On January 13, 2020, after concerning text messages had begun appearing on family members' phones, investigators from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, and Osceola County deputies returned to the Florida home. This time, they entered. What they found inside the home was the entire Tot family. Anthony's wife Megan, their oldest son Alec, their middle son Tyler, their youngest daughter Zoe, the family dog Breezy. None of them were alive. Anthony himself was alive in the home. He had consumed a large amount of an over-the-counter medication in what he claimed was a suicide attempt. The children, the autopsies would later show, had also been given the same medication. None of them had survived. The case made national news. Anthony Tot was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. His testimony in the years that followed would change multiple times. The trial began in early April 2022. The evidence presented showed that he had given his own children medication that ended their lives, that he had then ended his wife's life, and that he had been the only adult in the home throughout. He was convicted on all counts in April 2022. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He was given an additional year for the killing of the family dog. Loretta Tot, who had survived a bullet to the head almost 40 years earlier, was now the mother of a man convicted of killing his entire family. The 4-year-old who had stood in the home in Bensalem in 1980 and watched a stranger shoot his mother had grown up to do something his own. Father had once paid to have done, except this time on a scale that included his wife and all 3 of his own children. The grandchildren Loretta had loved, Alec and Tyler and Zoe, were no longer alive. The daughter-in-law Loretta had known for years was no longer alive. The family Loretta had watched her son build was gone in a single weekend in a small Florida community. Loretta has not given many public interviews. She has not stood at any news conferences. She has not been photographed in a courtroom. The Tot case in Florida was covered exhaustively by national media, but the woman at the center of the longer, deeper story, the woman whose own attempted murder in 1980 had been the first chapter of a saga that would not end until 2022, has remained quietly in the background. What is known is that she is alive. What is known is that she has carried more loss than most people in any country could carry across a single lifetime. She had been shot at 20-something years old by a teenage hire of her own husband. She had survived. She had rebuilt. She had given birth, raised, and seen grow into adulthood a son who, in a Florida home in the first weeks of 2020, did to his own family what his father had once tried to do to her. What stays in the public record about Loretta Tot is the strange, painful symmetry of her life. She is the mother who was supposed to die in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb in 1980 and did not. She is the mother who carried her 4-year-old out of that house and raised him in a different state with a different last name. She is the mother who was at the center of 2 of the most disturbing American family annihilation cases of the last 40 years, both connected by blood. She is the only mother on this list whose story bends through 2 complete decades of catastrophic family violence. The first one done to her, the second one done by her own son. She has lived. She is still living. The grandchildren whose names were Alec and Tyler and Zoe are not. The bullet that did not kill her in 1980 left her behind to learn, almost 40 years later, what her son had become. The 10 women in this collection lived through 10 different versions of the same impossible moment. Some of them were shot. Some of them were stabbed. Some of them were asleep in the next room. Some of them were never in the room at all. Some of them are now in the public record as advocates, as survivors, as quiet figures who have rebuilt what they could rebuild. What every one of them shares is something most mothers will never have to live through and could not imagine living through. They saw it happen. They lived through it. They woke up the next morning. They had to keep being mothers in a world that no longer contained the people they had been mothers to. Their stories, taken together, are not a story about violence. They are a story about what it costs a mother to survive when the people she was supposed to protect did not. Each of them carries that cost. Each of them carries it differently. None of them carries it lightly. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.